Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are on our 8th webinar, and today's speaker is Dr. Nuno Carvalhais. I hope I'm spelling well the name, who belongs to the small club or expanding club of the scientists committed to bridging the gap between the process-based and data-driven land modeling. And Nuno expertise actually is at the heart of this ML4LM project. And his talk would be on the land use of machine learning for modeling land surface dynamics. Nuno leads the model data integration group at the Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry since 2012. And he's a member of ELITENA, the European Laboratory for Learning and Intelligent System. He's also invited researcher at the University of Lisbon. His research focuses on the dynamic of terrestrial biogeochemical cycle, and particularly the improvement of the ecosystem modeling through data assimilation and inverse optimization. And Nuno is deeply committed to advancing the integration for machine learning with Earth system science to better predict ecosystem response to climate change. He collaborates internationally to develop innovative methods that improve the accuracy and interpretability of the land and biogeochemical model. And with this, I will let Nuno introduce his talk. And for your knowledge, the webinar recording will be available later on the ML4LM page. And you can put your question in the Q&A section that Nuno will try to answer at the end. Thank you. Up to you, Nuno.
Thank you very much, Wael. I also hope I say your name correctly. Thank you for the introduction, quite extensive. Hello, everyone. My name is Nuno, and I will explain a little bit what we have been doing in the perspective on the use of machine learning for modeling land surface dynamics. And one of the things that I kind of helped pen down a couple of years ago was a perspective on how we were seeing that machine learning could actually help us improve the way that we simulate land surface processes. And we kind of penned down a couple of perspective applications, like parameterization or process abstraction, replacing physical models by machine learning representation of responses or processes in land surface schemes. Also as observational operators, or for efficiency's sake as emulation. And we've been doing kind of some exercises on several of these aspects, and this is what I'm going to talk about to you today. And one of the ones that is my favorite one is on parameterizations and on how to use machine learning to address the perspective of parameterization in a model, in a process-based model. And not only driven by the fact that this is a topic that I've worked my PhD on and I continue working on, but also from the fact that ever since the 80s, more or less, or late 80s, early 90s, the parameterization of the processes that are controlled by terrestrial ecosystems is mostly driven by the plant functional types. And these have been implemented for practical reasons, I think, already then, and they are kept still today in the current representation of the land surface, even in Earth system models, of bigger system models. And this basically materializes in that the parameterization, so the parameter vector, like this theta here, that controls the response of terrestrial ecosystems to meteorology and changes in climate, is basically driven homogeneously in each grid cell that basically represents the land of a bigger system model or a global circulation model. And regardless of being coarse or fine, still the thing that we're actually trying to do is to represent a diversity of ecosystems that is far broader and deeper than the ones that can be clustered in 12, 14 classes of plant functional types. And that has materialized a lot of research, especially because like leveraging on observations from eddy covariance fluxes, which are basically where we mostly learn how to parameterize land surface schemes of our system models and even dynamic vegetation models. They've been distributed all over ecosystems, all over the world in different ecosystems. And one of the things we realized early on was that the ability to actually generalize those parameterizations was rather limited. So one of the things that we traditionally do when we work with these kind of data sets is to collect Earth observation and also in situ observations of carbon and water fluxes and tackle them together with Earth observation of vegetation activity, being that greenness, LAI, or FFR, and along with meteorological drivers, try to test, improve the parameterizations and actually the representation of processes in our models. And basically this boils down to an inversion exercise where we try to minimize the distance between the observables and the model outputs by proposing a set of parameter vectors that belong to a certain domain, here theta, that minimize the distance between what a model generates and an observation is measuring. And usually what we see is that we improve many things in the models. We improve the local representation of a bias, of the dynamics, the seasonal dynamics, and also of the subdaily cycles in models that actually do the representation of carbon and water fluxes at subdaily timescale. And when we look at it at a global scale, when we train these models locally, they will actually work pretty well, given that the parameterization locally is the one that is used after an inversion exercise. And this is where the problems a little bit emerge, is that when we are doing this here, a study by Shining Bao, where actually only based on a simple lattice efficiency model, we looked at an overall representation of the carbon fluxes against observations. And if we fit the model exactly to the data and we use that as the benchmark, we represent somewhat of a 96% on the spatial and temporal variability of carbon fluxes. We have here also an estimation of the nested cliff efficiency, and we see that the model becomes basically unbiased, and the normalized root mean square error is around like 10%. If we actually do the clustering of the parameter vectors according to plant functional type, by basically using like an expected value based on the mean or on the median, here we based on the mean, we actually see that in cross-validation, this performance goes from like explaining 96% of the observations to 58 and becomes much biased compared to the observations. So meaning that we have used the representation of the generalization of the parameters in a way that we actually use almost like half of the performance of the model to explain the spatial and the seasonal variability of ecosystem fluxes. And that is rather concerning. So we started doing some research on which other ways we would be able to represent those dynamics. And we also repeated some exercises that were done by other groups, like, for instance, Sylvain Coupel, that in 2012, I think, was doing like a joint site optimization, like lumping together all sites of the same plant functional type. And when we reproduce the same exercise that Sylvain Coupel did in 2012, we actually come up with a much better representation than the PFT mean, as he also used for, I think, evergreen needle-leaf forests at the time, and here was globally, but we still fall short around like 50% of the performance of the site calibration. So meaning that clustering the parameters or even optimizing site parameters according to the type of vegetation is actually falling short on the ability to represent that in cross-validation. So after that, we kind of like thought about it from a machine learning perspective, and what we tried to do, also very inspired by the work of Mark Pocel, was to try to identify covariates that could explain the variability of the parameters that are locally inverted. Here we see a relationship between parameters and parameters of the model and traits measured locally of vegetation. And we kind of got inspired that given that many of these traits are actually driven either by plant functional type as well, but also by soil types or by vegetation types, maybe one way that we can actually improve the representation of these parameterizations in cross-validation is to look at the output parameter vectors and try to find models that explain the variability of those parameter vectors in space. And once we tried to do that, what we actually did is using many different approaches like random forests or even neural networks, we didn't improve much from the approach of Sylvain Coppel, like clustering or plant functional type. And that we found that was a bit unreasonable compared to our expectations. And it was a lot driven also by the fact that we don't have so many sites to actually do this kind of exercise in a robust way. We kind of started thinking about the problem a bit coupled, like putting together a machine learning approach and also a process-based model, and trying to formalize a way that we would learn the parameters of the model based on a neural network, but doing the training end-to-end. So basically what we try to learn is actually a function G that enables us to predict the fluxes such that you have a model that is emerging from the output parameter vectors that emerge out of a neural network, minimizing the same type of cost functions that we do per site. And basically what this materializes into is that for every location of the eddy covariance network where we have fluxes, we extract a set of site features that we use as inputs to a neural network that outputs the parameters of the lattice efficiency in this case. And by minimizing the output of the model to the observations end-to-end, so meaning by learning not the parameters directly, but the weights that the neural network needs to have to explain the variability on the fluxes themselves, we do an end-to-end learning. And when we contrasted these with any other kind of approach that we used, we actually did better than the approach by Sylvain. So we use it like a PFT-oriented parameter inversion, but we still fall short on actually reaching to the site calibration. And we found several reasons behind it. One of them could be that the number of sites is actually insufficient for generalization. Maybe we have the wrong covariates. But it was actually already better than the estimations that were done before. So here we see like comparison with many other approaches that can be based on clustering approaches or learning site optimized parameters, contrasting to our end-to-end parameter learning. And one of the things that we actually realized that was becoming better when we do this kind of like approach that is learning end-to-end, as we can see here on the left, is that we had in the end tighter constraints on the spatial variation of the parameters of the physical model, or in this case of the lattice efficiency model. We didn't have so much edge hitting approaches, so it means that we were overfitting less than what we can do when we're actually inverting only a single site. One of the things that we tried to do after was actually trying to understand what would be the covariates that would explain this spatial variation in the parameters. And when we look at different approaches that we used, so the SHAP or layer-wise propagation or partial dependency plots, we saw that the ranking of the importance of variables to explain the outputs was actually changing according to the method, which was not something really tangible for us once we were looking at what would explain this parameter variability in space. And this kind of brought us to the question that, okay, we can go from a planned functional type to kind of a continuous representation of parameters that maybe are emerging from natural processes. But we weren't really confident that this emergent pattern is reflecting any state variable dependency or any latent variable representation that would be associated to physical properties of the ecosystems that we are not representing in the model. And that's still today puts a question, because we're not actually the only ones that find that this variation in the explanatory variables or the sensitivities emerging from different methods or from different folds of a data set is actually pervasive across modeling approaches. We thought that maybe one of the reasons for this kind of variability is also the fact that the model was simple, and given that the ultimate goal that we have is to represent states and fluxes and have a dynamic representation of the carbon and water fluxes in the land surface, we actually worked on making the parameterization of a whole terrestrial ecosystem model. So going from simple representation of GVP and evapotranspiration to actually represent a dynamical system where we would do not only the carbon and water fluxes, but also aspects of their partitioning according to different processes like transpiration, soil evaporation, and also trying to constrain the outputs not only on the fluxes, but also on the state variables that underpin the representation of the dynamics of fluxes or state variables in time according to meteorological conditions. So basically what we have here is actually a dynamical model that represents the carbon and water fluxes in terrestrial ecosystems at local scales. We did the same kind of exercise. We basically coupled it. We had to use this approach called mixed gradients, where we would basically calculate the Jacobian and the derivative and the differentiable part of the model in real time and multiply both to get the updates on the NN weights. And we did that in a model that is not very different from the representation of the carbon and the water fluxes in a land surface scheme. We did the same kind of experiment, so we consider that the baseline is the in situ inversion, while the hybrid modeling approach would try to learn the neural network that represents the spatial variation of parameters that best fit the observations. And we do this in a set of eddy covariance sites also around the world. And what we have here is just like a zoom over two of these locations. So here on the right, we have Poix-Chabon in France, when we're looking at the in situ inversion in blue and the hybrid inversion in orange. And we see that we have a representation, or a very reasonable representation, of the carbon and of the water fluxes for this particular site. Once we look at another site in Tonsi Range in the US, we still see the same kind of like dynamics in terms of the seasonal cycle, but we're actually appreciating quite a reasonable bias on the hybrid version compared to the hybrid model. And this is actually expected, because we're not expecting to do as good, a representation as good as the locally fitted model, but we're actually expecting for the generalization to be better than just using Planck functional type in cross-validation. So here what we're seeing is across the data sets that we are using for constraining the model, we see that the hybrid approach always has a cost, so meaning a performance that is lower, a higher cost compared to both gross fluxes as well as any water fluxes, and also with phenology and biomass. And when we do this comparison on a one-to-one, we see that the in situ performance is usually better than the hybrid modeling. In the rare cases where we see that is actually the opposite, it's probably because we have a multiple constraint cost function. So we could actually do a representation of a flux better than another, and being that then the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency, or actually the inverse of the normalized Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency, would be better in the hybrid compared to the in situ. But in general, what we see is that there is a correlation between the performance in the hybrid and the performance in the calibrated model. And of course, there is a slope, and that slope is lower than 1, so we're not doing as a good job as the calibration. But what this means is that in locations where we're actually expecting for the model to behave better when we do calibration, they're also the ones where we are doing a good performance with the hybrid model. And here, again, we come to this aspect where when we compare the spatial distribution of the emergent parameters, when we just do the parameterization based on a Planck functional type based approach or on a continuous approach, we see that they don't correlate. The drivers of the spatialization of parameters that control the best performance in the cross-validation for the in situ exercises do not follow the patterns of the Planck functional type. They show similarities in a representation of parameters that are opposite to what the Planck functional type characterization does. And still, the question emerges, what is the interpretation? If there is a reasonable interpretation on this spatial variability of parameters compared to what we understand to be ecosystem dynamics and representation. So in these first exercises, one of the things that we're realizing about parameterization is that PFT alone is a poor predictor, while PFT jointly with other covariates improves the representation of the parameterization of the model. And we do think that plant form and structure actually are a strong determinant of a parameterization of a model. These global parameter variations do not follow Planck functional type patterns. And this aspect that individual feature relevance is contingent on the approach, or even on the fold of the same approach, as we see on the right, is kind of asking us to think a bit better on how to use this aspect of like hybrid modeling for parameterization in a way that we're actually going more towards hypothesis-oriented selection of variables, and then meaning that the fit will not be that good, but maybe the representation and human understanding of the results would be larger. On another perspective, one of the things that we've been doing regarding this joint marriage between machine learning and process-based modeling is actually to abstract processes where we're uncertain about their physical representation. And one of them has been fire. And as you know, fire is kind of a very relevant process in the Earth system. It changes completely ecosystem structures. It has a very strong impact into atmospheric and not only variables. And it's stochastic by nature. So it actually is a very good problem for machine learning that excels in problems where deterministic representations are poor, but data is large. So there has been a wide range of exercises that have been showing that machine learning approaches actually represent well observational data sets, both globally and regionally, for different aspects of fire, being that ignition, fire spread, or even burned area. They outscore traditional fire weather approaches. And lately, there has been a very strong emphasis on fuel moisture or fuel availability as a driving factor of fire. Thought this had to be a very good combination of a scientific question about the drivers of burned area and a methodological one if we could actually abstract the process of fire representation in the land surface scheme. So here, what we're actually doing is to go in a dynamic model as well. So here we did it in JSBach, the land surface representation of the icon ESM, and we replaced the fire model by a machine learning approach learned from observations. So basically the thing that we wanted to do was to go in the model structure or in the module that represents the effect of fire in the carbon cycle and replace that by a machine learning approach. And by design, we needed to expose the model to variables that are also internal in a land surface scheme or in an Earth system model. So we could define the same atmospheric variables as are observed from reanalysis, but we could not expose it to the same type of Earth observation data from remote sensing, and we had to do it based on variables that would also be state variables from the land surface scheme. So we had to reduce the set of variables to be used in the training of the model to variables like LAI or soil moisture, or even the representation of the diversity of plant functional types within the grid cell. And we could introduce an aspect that would be the effect of anthropogenic activity by using features that are specially representing the development stage and the location where fire is happening. So we use it here as the anthropogenic effect. And we did this training in different areas according to the GFED fire regions. The kind of architecture that we used here separated explicitly the weather from the land, from the anthropogenic variables, so that we could do the a posteriori an attribution of importance based on the family of variables rather than uniquely on the variable itself. And what we saw when we developed the deep learning approach at global scale was that we had a very good agreement between the deep learning model developed from observations and the GFED4 product. We also had a very good agreement in terms of spatial patterns and global time series during the training period. And once we plugged in the model to the JSBach itself, so meaning the hybrid model, we saw that we didn't have a performance as high as in the deep learning approach, but we did still maintain the representation of the spatial features of burned area, as well as the dynamics of the global burned area. And this was actually something that was very rewarding, especially because when we, especially because when you start looking at derived variables that were not directly used for the training of the model, like here in this case, the big fire season, we saw that there was a much better representation between the deep learning or the hybrid model that we developed and the observations when contrasted to the simple fire model that was in JSBach 4. Also, when we go to interpretation and looking at the seasonal variability of fire activity, we see that in general, the model behaves rather well compared to observations once it's coupled to the land surface scheme. But that's not always the case. So if we look under the hood, what we see is that there are regions where actually the hybrid model does not outperform the deep learning model or even the simple approach that is used in GSBAH. And that is mostly driven by the fact that we have a variable importance here where we look at the LAI and the importance of LAI to predict the fire in Southeast Asia. And there is a bias in the way that the model inherently represents the LAI when compared to the observations. So there is a limitation in doing the offline training and online inference when we're developing a model that speaks to the fact that biases on state variables that are internally calculated by the model will basically cascade into biases also in the variable interest, in this case with burned area. I think it's kind of logical, but it was interesting to see that maps to observations. We see the same thing in the Mediterranean, where the soil moisture seemed to be the candidate variable behind an overestimation of burned area in the region. And that led us to rethink this aspect of like offline training and online inference. Another example where we're actually still following this offline-online is in the representation of stomatal conductance and photosynthesis in a more complex model, in this case, the GSBAH. So here, the work of Reda, what we actually did was to develop a neural network that would estimate the GS and a scalar for VCmax and Jmax for photosynthesis. And basically on the first instance to learn the model architecture from the GSBAH parameterization itself, and downstream also include it in the representation, learn it from medical variance fluxes and include it in the representation of the carbon and water fluxes in GSBAH. And I wish this was data. It's actually model data. What we see here is the representation of the fluxes from the physical model and from the hybrid model. When the hybrid model is actually trained on the physical model, it is expected that we have such a level of fitness. And when we train our hybrid architecture then on FluxNet, we see a degradation of the ability to perform or to represent the sub-daily, daily, seasonal variability of the fluxes. This problem becomes a little bit larger when, after running the model offline, we integrate that in the actually dynamic model, and we do these estimations in a coupled way. And that is basically a challenge that is also a technical one, because many times these model architectures and the language in which the models are written are not prepared to be differentiable and to be integrated into machine learning pipelines. And that's a challenge that we've actually been working on and developing tools to actually accommodate. So one of the things that we learned from these two exercises that are quite different in terms of processes from each other is that abstracting the process to a machine learning component actually leads to a reduction of uncertainty. But once we integrate the model in a non-line way for inference, we actually see again error inflation. And that is something that we think that technically requires developments that fall a little bit beyond the traditional simulation and modeling architectures. The work that we've been doing also in terms of dynamics for phenology is very much driven by very detailed observations from phenocams, and this is the work of Christian Heimers and Alex Winkler, where they're actually using phenocam data to train a modeling architecture for determining not only the onset and the offset, but actual dynamics of phenology, in this case in deciduous broadleaf forests in temperate systems. So here was in the US. And a very striking observation is that even compared to very adaptive approaches like the growing season index or an LSTM, an approach that relies on a design separating the different controlling factors for phenology is not only outperforming by almost 50% the mean squared error, but also in terms of like R square and even between year variability of phenology, which I think it's an amazing feature. One of the things that this type of architectures then allow us also to do in the same way that we can do it in process-based models is to actually try to understand what is the sensitivity of phenology to the different families of drivers along the seasonal cycle. And here, one of the things to activate is this idea that the difference here in sensitivities is more associated to the fact that during the season, these models actually predict different sensitivities. And by doing so, they can also be used to benchmark traditional models and maybe generating hypotheses in many of the controlling factors of phenology during the year. So overall, one of the things that we've been learning is that the support that machine learning is providing for older problems is that we're improving parameterizations, and there are other approaches other than the ones that we've been using here that speak to history matching or simulation-based inference, where emulators are used to invert parameters based on observations. But it also lends support for this aspect of process abstraction. Although we're seeing that there is an expansion of information content from or transfer from observations to the models, because we see that we improve a lot the fits to observations even in cross-validation and reduce the uncertainties, we're finding that this aspect of like offline learning to do online inference actually speaks to designing frameworks that are differentiable and can be in some way interpretable, because one of the things that we're finding is that we not only generate new patterns of fluxes, but we generate new features and new patterns in features that we associate to either state variables that should be fixed, like what we traditionally call parameters, or they should be dynamic. But when we try to explain them with different approaches coming from XAI or other fields, we find that the results are sensitive to the approach that we're using. So this doesn't clear ambiguities on the driving factors. I believe that here, having approaches that are more driven by hypotheses allows us to better learn in comparison to having the machines learning by us. So I think that we're finding a little bit of a conjunction between this hypothesis-driven and data-driven paradigm. So I think we have here the cycle of how we've been developing models for a very long time, where we could start from a theory or an hypothesis, develop a model, contrast it with observations that then would verify or not the model or the theory that we would have. But we could also start from observation data, and from that develop a theory that then will materialize in a model and with independent data validate. And what we're actually seeing with these adaptive models is that we generate patterns of, in this case, like interest variables. And by integrating machine learning approaches with process-based models, we have observation-based patterns of features that require interpretation. Their contrast with predicted patterns can be one way, but the other way is actually to use these features maybe to learn new things at scale about the hypotheses that we believe underpin many of the assumptions of the models, maybe justifying or not some old theories that have been basically inherited through different decades of research in natural sciences. This work has been done by many people that are not me, and I'm very thankful to the fact that they wanted to collaborate and to engage in actually doing research that was deeper than the one that we envisioned in the beginning. And with this, I want to thank you. We have a framework where we're actually training many of these approaches for hybrid modeling. And also we're trying to expand from just looking at the land to looking at different compartments of the Earth system in understanding if these approaches of hybrid modeling and putting machine learning and process-based modeling together can actually drive us not only to have better fits with observations, but also to understand better the Earth system. And with this, I thank you for your time. And I think I take questions now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nuno, for this very comprehensive overview of the work done in your group and done by you as well. If there is any question, please put it in the Q&A section. And because I cannot really type into that part myself, so I will ask my question straight away to you. So it was quite interesting to see that the sensitivity to predictor changed substantially with the machine learning method. And I was wondering whether there are tests to check the sensitivity of these change and how they are affected by the spatial and time scale, like what you did for the phenology at the end, I think, to see that the seasonality, whether this could be also diminishing this change in the sensitivity of the machine learning method.
Yes. So I think there are a couple of aspects there. So one is that according to the method that we can use as a post-processing to determine the factors that drive the variability of parameters, we actually find different answers. And there are many approaches from XAI that use the model and the input to output relationship of the model to do this. But what we're finding is that it doesn't allow us to understand better or to be non-ambiguous when different approaches give us different answers, right? I mean, when we start doing the ranking of family of variables, they usually agree, maybe because they are very correlated internally. That's the reason why the ranking at family level is similar, although individual variables are not. But also the examples that we see from other studies is that just by using a different sample of the same data set, we could find different optimums or different sensitivities from a parameter to a forcing. And this is where I think that the selection of variables are going in a direction of being more hypothesis driven and hypothesis testing rather than purely fitting could help us understand and generate hypotheses why these patterns emerge, or what's the link between continuous features and particle parameterizations. And here what we see in the work of Christian is actually that these sensitivities emerge differently in different seasons of the year. So we didn't even consider different timescales. It was just different periods of the year. And that could be because like this relationship was established exactly for those periods. So we can see these as a sensitivity test that also can be applied to process-based models. So we can use this for model benchmarking. And it's also a point where we see that then narrowing down the sensitivity from like families of variables like for water, temperature, or energy to individual ones can have a bit of a challenge. But the fact that we're able to cluster them, I think it's very rewarding for the approach. Still, I think we lack on the interpretation in the end on how to go beyond fitting and derive understanding from it. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. I see no question in the QA section, so I'll try to have one more myself. It's more specific. It's more common. It's because of these. I mean, the PFT are being like the beast or the black duck for the modeling this latest year. So I think it's a good sentence to say they are not useless at all, but they contribute also to what we see. So what is your opinion on that?
I think it's so. I think they were taken by a practical and observational perspective. But what our exercises are showing is that if you just use PFT alone, they still represent a good portion of the variability of the data in cross-validation, but they don't abstract biases, for instance. So I do think that plant form and I mean, because trees are different than grasses, grasses are different than shrubs. If you have a phenology that is deciduous or evergreen, that affects also your seasonality. The type of leaf affects the way that you interfere with radiation, and all of that then materializes into a different response. I do think there is a lot of knowledge inside this PFT. And there's probably a strong covariation between PFT and climate zones. And that's why maybe when we plugged in PFT, climate zones, and soil types, the improvement is not that large, right? But what we're seeing is that the within PFT variability is so large that we really need to understand how these parameters that we abstract to plant functional type are being controlled by structural form of ecosystems, but also by other features on land. And this is why I think that I also agree with you. To me, it was an ugly duckling like 4 years ago. And now I'm kind of, okay, there is a utility point there. And I think we need to build beyond that. And I'm just curious on how to do it in a better way than what we've done so far.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, that's a very nice answer for me. Yeah, I still see no other question, but I would like to ask the audience for future presentation. If you have any like suggestion, we are on the process of preparing for the next year program. So if you have any suggestion for the ML4LM, please send it to GeoX or myself so we can take it into account for the next webinar series. And I would like to thank Nuno very much for his very nice presentation, and see you in the next webinar. Bye.
Bye.